I was cleaning out my late father's storage unit, 14 months after his death, when I found a cardboard box of typewritten manuscript pages, yellowed and brittle, sitting beneath a stack of old tax records. 3 complete, unpublished novels, each one bearing my father's own handwritten notes in the margins, each one dated in his careful, precise handwriting, sometime between 1991 and 1997. I recognized the plot of the second manuscript immediately, because I had read it before, in a considerably more polished, professionally published form, under a different title, credited to a different author, my own uncle, Stephen Whitfield, my father's younger brother, whose novel, The Long Season, had been published in 2004, had won a respected regional literary award, and had, over the following 2 decades, become the foundation of a genuinely successful career as a mid-list literary novelist, 3 additional books, a small but devoted readership, and notably, a reputation within our extended family as the writer. A reputation I had, my entire life, understood as simply, factually true. It took me 9 months, a forensic linguistics expert, a publishing law attorney, and a genuinely difficult reckoning with my own uncle to establish, through detailed stylometric analysis and my father's own preserved handwritten drafts, that The Long Season, along with, we would eventually determine significant portions of 2 of my uncle's 3 subsequent novels, had not been written by Stephen Whitfield at all. It had been written by my father, more than a decade earlier, and quietly, systematically taken. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including, in today's story, a war fought not over money or property in the ordinary sense, but over words themselves, and over exactly whose name deserved to sit beneath them. Today's story is called The Book That Wasn't His. Let's begin. My name is Claire Whitfield Morgan. I'm 40 years old. I work as a high school English teacher outside Portland, Oregon, and my father, David Whitfield, died 16 months ago at the age of 71, following a lengthy illness that gave our family, at least, the difficult mercy of time to prepare, even amid the genuine grief of watching him decline. My father worked, for most of his adult life, as a technical writer for a regional engineering firm, a steady, unglamorous career that paid our family's bills throughout my entire childhood. But that never fully reflected what I understood, even as a child, to be his genuine, deeper passion. Writing fiction, a pursuit he maintained quietly, consistently, and almost entirely privately, throughout evenings and weekends across several decades of his adult life. I want to describe the specific, particular relationship my father had with his own fiction writing, because it matters enormously to understanding both what was eventually taken from him and why the theft remained undiscovered for so long. My father was, by nature, a genuinely private, somewhat self-doubting person when it came to his own creative work. He wrote consistently, seriously, and based on what I would eventually learn through the manuscripts themselves, with real, considerable skill, but he rarely shared his work openly, even with close family, and had, as far as I knew throughout my entire childhood, never seriously pursued formal publication. My uncle Stephen, roughly 4 years younger than my father, took a considerably different, more outwardly ambitious path with his own writing aspirations, pursuing an MFA in creative writing in his late 20s, actively networking within literary circles, and by the early 2000s, achieving the kind of modest but genuine professional publishing success that had, throughout my entire life, established him within our extended family as the writer. The one who had actually pursued and achieved the creative dream both brothers had apparently once shared. I want to describe finding those manuscripts, because the specific, disorienting process of that discovery matters to understanding how gradually, and how genuinely reluctantly, I came to accept what they eventually proved to represent. My father had maintained a small storage unit outside Portland for several decades, containing, primarily old family records, furniture from my childhood home he'd never quite parted with, and I discovered an extensive personal archive of his own writing, journals, notebooks, and in that specific cardboard box, 3 complete, typewritten novel manuscripts, each meticulously dated and organized. each bearing extensive handwritten revision notes in his own distinctive, careful hand. I want to be honest that my initial reaction, upon finding these manuscripts, was primarily one of genuine, poignant discovery about my father's own private creative life. A bittersweet, meaningful glimpse into a passion he had, throughout my entire childhood, kept almost entirely to himself. Work I felt genuinely eager to read, both out of simple curiosity and out of a specific, grief-driven desire to understand this hidden dimension of who my father had actually been. I began reading the first manuscript that same evening, and it was somewhere in the second manuscript, a novel my father had titled, according to his own handwritten cover page, Autumn's Reckoning, dated 1994, that I began experiencing a specific, disorienting sense of familiarity that gradually, over the following several chapters, crystallized into genuine, mounting alarm. The plot, the central characters, even several specific, distinctive scenes and pieces of dialogue, matched with unmistakable precision my Uncle Stephen's published novel, The Long Season. A book I had read myself years earlier, shortly after its 2004 publication, and had at the time genuinely admired as a meaningful, well-crafted piece of literary fiction, entirely unaware, until that specific evening reading my father's dated 1994 manuscript, that I might have already read its true, original source a decade before Stephen's version had ever reached publication. I want to describe the specific, careful process I undertook over the following several days to move beyond my own initial, unsettled impression toward something closer to genuine, methodical comparison between my father's manuscript and Stephen's published novel. I pulled my own copy of The Long Season from my bookshelf, a copy Stephen had, notably, personally inscribed to me at the time of its publication, an inscription I found myself rereading with a specific, growing discomfort as I began the careful, chapter-by-chapter comparison that followed. The similarities, once I began this more systematic comparison, proved considerably more extensive and specific than I had initially registered during that first, more impressionistic evening of reading. The novel's central premise, a young man returning to his rural hometown following his own father's death, navigating a complicated inheritance dispute with an estranged brother, while uncovering a long-buried family secret connected to a decades-old accident, matched precisely between both versions. Several specific scenes, including what I recognized as the emotional climax of both books, a confrontation between the two brothers at their father's now-empty family home, match not just in broad structure but in specific, distinctive details, and in several passages, in language that felt, reading both versions side by side, considerably too similar to reflect mere thematic coincidence or shared inspiration. I want to describe the specific, difficult emotional process of recognizing this pattern, because I think it's important context for understanding why I didn't immediately, confidently conclude that outright theft had occurred, despite the mounting evidence in front of me. Stephen was, and had been throughout my entire life, someone I genuinely loved and respected, a warm, engaged uncle who had, at various points throughout my own childhood and young adulthood, offered genuine encouragement and support for my own eventual career choices. The specific possibility that he had, decades earlier, taken his own brother's unpublished work and claimed it as his own felt, even amid the mounting textual evidence in front of me, genuinely difficult to fully accept as the most likely explanation. I want to describe what I found, several days later, in the third and final manuscript in that storage unit box, because it extended the pattern I'd already identified into territory that made the underlying explanation considerably harder to avoid. This third manuscript, dated 1996 according to my father's own handwritten notation, corresponded with similarly extensive and specific overlap to Stephen's third published novel, Harvest Moon. Released in 2011, a full 7 years after The Long Season, suggesting, if my growing suspicion was accurate, that whatever had happened with the first manuscript hadn't been an isolated, single instance, but potentially reflected a considerably more sustained, ongoing pattern spanning multiple books across Stephen's entire published career. I retained, at this point, roughly 2 weeks into my own increasingly urgent, independent investigation, a specialized intellectual property attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, who explained, during our first consultation, the specific legal and evidentiary framework that would be necessary to move from my own personal, if increasingly confident, suspicion toward something legally, formally established. "I want to be direct about what we're going to need to build a genuinely strong case here," Margaret told me. "Textual similarity alone, however extensive, can sometimes be explained away as coincidence, shared influence, or even legitimate collaborative development between family members who discussed ideas together over the years. What we need is expert forensic analysis, specifically capable of establishing authorship with genuine scientific rigor, a field called forensic stylometry, which analyzes specific, distinctive patterns in an author's writing style, patterns that tend to remain remarkably consistent across an individual's body of work, and that are genuinely difficult for a different writer to fully replicate, even when directly copying or closely adapting another person's underlying content. I want to explain, in some detail, what forensic stylometric analysis actually involves, because I think understanding this specific, genuinely fascinating forensic methodology matters to appreciating exactly how definitively our eventual case was established. Margaret connected me with a forensic linguist, Dr. Raymond Osei, who specializes specifically in authorship attribution analysis, a field that has, he explained during our initial consultation, developed considerably in recent decades, driven by advances in computational linguistics capable of analyzing an author's distinctive, largely unconscious patterns, specific word choice frequencies, sentence structure tendencies, punctuation habits, and dozens of other subtle, measurable stylistic markers that tend to remain remarkably stable across a given author's body of work, regardless of the specific subject matter or genre they're writing in at any given time. "I want you to understand why this analysis can be so genuinely definitive," Dr. Osei explained during our first meeting. "When someone directly copies or closely adapts another writer's content, they're typically focused, consciously, on the plot, the characters, the major structural elements, the parts of writing that feel, to most people, like the real creative content. What they're considerably less likely to consciously think about, and therefore considerably less likely to successfully alter or disguise, are the deeper, more unconscious stylistic patterns underlying how they actually construct individual sentences. Patterns that, once properly analyzed and compared across a sufficient body of text, can establish authorship attribution with a degree of statistical confidence that genuinely rivals, in many respects, the kind of certainty DNA evidence provides in other contexts." Dr. Osei's analysis, conducted over the following several weeks, compared my father's 3 unpublished manuscripts against Stephen's 4 published novels, alongside, critically, a broader comparison sample of my father's other preserved writing, personal journals, letters, and technical writing samples from his professional career, establishing a genuine, independent baseline for my father's own distinctive stylistic patterns, separate from any of the specific manuscripts directly at issue. Dr. Osei's completed report, delivered roughly 6 weeks after our initial consultation, was genuinely definitive in a way that exceeded even my own, by that point, fairly confident expectations. The report established, with a statistical confidence Dr. Ose characterized as exceptionally strong, well beyond the threshold typically required for genuine forensic reliability in legal proceedings, that the stylistic patterns underlying The Long Season and Harvest Moon matched my father's independently established writing patterns considerably more closely than they matched the stylistic patterns evident in Stephen's own, more clearly independently authored work, specifically his first published novel, Riverbend, released in 2001, 3 years before The Long Season, which Dr. Osei's analysis established as reflecting a genuinely distinct, independent stylistic pattern from the 2 later novels my father's manuscripts corresponded to. This specific finding regarding Riverbend mattered enormously to the overall case's credibility, because it established, quite powerfully, that Stephen was, in fact, a genuine, independently capable writer in his own right. His first novel reflected authentic, original authorship, a fact that made the subsequent, dramatic stylistic shift in his second and third novels, precisely coinciding with content that matched my father's own dated, unpublished manuscripts. Considerably more difficult to explain as anything other than exactly what the evidence increasingly suggested. A sustained pattern of Stephen taking his brother's private, unpublished work and building his own subsequent literary career substantially upon it. I want to be careful and precise about what this analysis can and cannot definitively establish, Dr. Ose told me, once I'd reviewed his completed findings. Forensic stylometry provides genuinely strong, scientifically grounded evidence regarding authorship attribution. It doesn't, on its own, definitively establish every specific detail of exactly how or why this pattern occurred. Whether your uncle directly copied your father's manuscripts wholesale, or whether some more complicated process of adaptation and revision occurred. But it does establish, with genuine scientific rigor, that the core authorial voice underlying these specific novels originated with your father, not with your uncle, regardless of whatever specific mechanism eventually explains how that authorship came to be misattributed. I want to address a genuinely important, difficult question this entire discovery raised. Why had my father, throughout the following 2 decades, never once spoken up about what had apparently happened to his own work? I want to describe the specific, painful process of trying to understand this question, working through my father's own preserved journals and personal papers, alongside Margaret and Dr. Osai's continued investigation, searching for any indication of what my father himself had understood or felt about whatever had actually occurred between himself and Stephen regarding these manuscripts. I found, roughly midway through this search, a specific journal entry, dated shortly after the Long Seasons' original 2004 publication, that offered genuine, if painful, insight into my father's own contemporaneous understanding and response. I want to be careful, consistent with this channel's general practice, not to reproduce my father's private journal entry verbatim, but I can describe, in general terms, what it revealed. My father had, in fact, recognized his own work in Stephen's published novel immediately upon its release, and had confronted Stephen directly, privately, shortly after publication. A confrontation that, according to my father's own account, Stephen had responded to by acknowledging he had, in fact, drawn substantially from my father's earlier, unpublished manuscript, but characterizing this as a legitimate, if perhaps insufficiently credited. Collaborative development of ideas the two brothers had discussed together over the years, rather than as the more straightforward theft my father's own manuscripts and Dr. Osai's eventual forensic analysis would ultimately suggest had actually occurred. My father's journal entry described choosing not to pursue any further, more formal confrontation or legal action at the time, reflecting, in his own words, a specific, painful calculation about the genuine cost, both financial and to his relationship with his only sibling, of pursuing a legal battle he wasn't certain he could definitively win. Absent the kind of forensic analytical tools that, in 2004, either didn't yet exist in their current mature form, or weren't readily accessible or affordable to an ordinary, private individual in his position. I want to describe my own confrontation with Stephen, once Dr. Osai's forensic analysis had definitively confirmed what I'd increasingly suspected, a conversation that occurred at his own home, roughly 4 months into my broader investigation. I found Dad's manuscripts. I told him, without significant preamble, once we'd settled into his living room. Autumn's Reckoning and the third one, dated 1996. I've had a forensic linguist compare them against your published novels. I need you to explain to me what actually happened, and I need you to be honest with me, because I already know considerably more than you might be assuming right now. Stephen's initial reaction unfolded through a sequence I recognized, having researched other family fraud cases extensively for this channel's other stories, as genuinely, distressingly familiar. An initial attempt to minimize and reframe, characterizing his use of my father's work as legitimate creative, inspiration, and collaborative development, rather than direct, substantial appropriation, before gradually. Once I made clear exactly how definitive Dr. Osai's forensic findings actually were, shifting toward something closer to a fuller, if still carefully qualified, acknowledgement. Your father and I used to talk about our writing constantly, back then, Stephen told me, at one point during that difficult conversation. We'd share ideas, read each other's drafts, offer feedback. I genuinely came to think of some of what emerged from those conversations as, in some sense, shared creative territory, not purely his individual exclusive property. I understand now that's not how he ultimately came to see it, and I understand, hearing about that journal entry, that our original 2004 conversation clearly didn't actually resolve things the way I convinced myself, at the time, that it had. He wrote complete manuscripts, Stephen, I said. Complete novels with his own name on the cover page, dated years before your books were published. That's not shared creative territory. That's his work, that you took and published under your own name for 2 decades, while he apparently decided it wasn't worth the fight to properly stop you. I want to walk through the specific, genuinely complex legal landscape Margaret navigated in pursuing formal accountability for what had happened. Because copyright and authorship disputes of exactly this kind, particularly ones extending back multiple decades, involve genuinely significant legal complexity. I want to be honest about the specific challenges here, Margaret explained during our case planning. Copyright infringement claims generally carry a 3-year statute of limitations from the date of discovery, which works in our favor here, since you only recently discovered the actual underlying evidence, despite the original publication occurring decades ago. Courts generally apply what's called the discovery rule in exactly this kind of situation, starting the clock from when a reasonable person would have discovered the infringement, rather than from the original publication date itself. What's more complicated is that your father himself apparently discovered this and made a conscious, if understandable, decision not to formally pursue it at the time, which Stephen's own attorney is very likely going to argue means any claim should have been raised considerably closer to that original 2004 discovery, rather than reset entirely by your own, more recent independent discovery of the same underlying facts. Margaret's ultimate legal strategy involved pursuing the claim on behalf of my father's estate, of which I served as executor, framing the case not as a fresh, independent claim based on my own 2004 adjacent discovery timeline, but as a claim my father himself had always retained the right to pursue, which had simply never been formally, legally resolved or waived during his own lifetime, and which his estate now retained standing to pursue on his behalf. Particularly given the considerably stronger, scientifically rigorous evidence Dr. Osai's forensic analysis now provided. Evidence that hadn't existed in any comparably reliable form back in 2004, when my father had made his own original, difficult decision not to pursue formal action. Stephen, once fully confronted with Dr. Osai's forensic findings and Margaret's formal legal case, retained his own attorney, and rather than proceeding to a full, protracted legal battle, entered into settlement negotiations roughly 2 months after our initial confrontation. I want to describe the specific, genuinely complicated questions this negotiation needed to address, extending well beyond simple financial compensation into genuinely difficult questions about authorship credit, ongoing publication rights, and how, if at all, the historical record of these 2 specific novels might be formally, publicly corrected going forward. The eventual settlement, reached roughly 5 months after negotiations began, included several distinct provisions I want to walk through, because I think they illustrate the genuinely unusual, multifaceted nature of remedying exactly this kind of intellectual property harm, extending well beyond the more straightforward financial recovery featured in several of this channel's other stories. Stephen agreed to formal, public acknowledgement of my father's primary authorship of both The Long Season and Harvest Moon, an acknowledgement to be included in all future editions and printings of both books, credited as based on the original work of David Whitfield. alongside a negotiated financial settlement reflecting a substantial portion of the royalties both books had generated over their respective publication histories, an amount that, once finalized, came to just over $340,000, representing what Margaret and Stephen's own attorney ultimately negotiated as a fair, if inherently imperfect, accounting of the financial benefit Stephen had derived from work that had not, in fact, originated primarily with him. I want to address a genuinely interesting, complicated question our family needed to work through regarding the practical, ongoing question of what should actually happen to these two specific novels going forward, given their considerable existing readership and the genuine, if now fundamentally complicated, literary reputation they'd built over 2 decades. Margaret, working with Stephen's own publisher once the settlement's authorship acknowledgement provisions required coordination with the actual publishing house, navigated a genuinely unusual process of updating both books' formal publication records, and for any future printings, their actual cover and copyright page credits. A process the publisher, once presented with Dr. Osai's forensic findings and the formal settlement agreement, ultimately agreed to implement. Updating both novels' official author credit to reflect Stephen Whitfield, based on the original work of David Whitfield. A specific, carefully negotiated formulation intended to honestly, accurately reflect the genuinely complicated reality of the book's actual authorship history. I want to describe what it felt like, receiving my own copy of the newly updated edition of The Long Season. Several months after the settlement's formal implementation, seeing my father's name, for the first time, printed on the cover of a book that had, for 2 decades, existed in the world credited entirely to someone else. I wish he could have seen this, I told my own husband, holding that updated copy for the first time. I wish, more than almost anything else about this entire ordeal, that he could have known, while he was still alive, that the truth would eventually come out, that his name would eventually actually be attached to the words he spent all those quiet evenings writing. I want to describe, honestly, where my relationship with Stephen currently stands, roughly a year and a half after this entire ordeal began. We speak occasionally, primarily connected through broader extended family gatherings, and notably through Stephen's own continued, genuine efforts to make amends beyond what the formal settlement itself required, including, roughly 8 months after the settlement, personally, publicly acknowledging the situation at a regional literary festival appearance, describing, in considerably more direct and less minimizing language than he'd initially offered me privately, exactly what had happened decades earlier, and taking full, public responsibility for having built a significant portion of his own literary career on his brother's uncredited, unconsented work. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why I made the choices I made, all those years ago, Stephen told me, during a recent conversation, roughly describing that public acknowledgement. I've thought about it more than almost anything else in my life, trying to understand exactly when I convinced myself that what I was doing was something other than what it actually, clearly was. I don't have a satisfying answer, even now. What I do have is a genuine, ongoing commitment to trying to make this right, in whatever ways still remain possible. For as long as it takes. I've chosen, unlike Diane in this channel's previous story, to remain in some form of ongoing relationship with Stephen, a decision I want to be honest reflects, in part, the specific, different nature of what he did, a theft of creative work and credit that, while genuinely serious and genuinely painful to fully process, didn't involve the same category of direct, ongoing physical or financial exploitation some of this channel's other stories have described. I don't know if I've fully forgiven him, but I've found a version of ongoing relationship that feels honest and sustainable to me, built now on a foundation of full acknowledged truth rather than the decades of unknowing deception that preceded it. I want to describe something I learned roughly a year into this process, once Stephen's public acknowledgement had made the broader story known within regional literary circles. A small writing group Stephen had belonged to throughout the early 2000s, several of whose members had, for over 2 decades, understood themselves to have watched The Long Season develop, in workshop form, directly from Stephen's own creative process. I met with two of these former writing group members, a woman named Beatrice Holloway and a man named Frank Duarte, both of whom described genuine, vivid memories of Stephen, presenting chapters of the novel for group critique throughout roughly 2002 and 2003. Memories that had, for over 20 years, formed part of their own understanding of the book's genuine creative development. "I want to be honest that this is genuinely disorienting to learn," Beatrice told me, once I'd explained the situation and shared some of Dr. Osai's findings. "I remember specific conversations about character choices, about revisions Stephen made based on our feedback. I don't know how to reconcile those specific, vivid memories with what you're telling me actually happened underneath all of it." I want to describe what Margaret eventually helped me understand about this specific detail, once I raised it with her directly. "It's entirely possible, and I think even likely, that Stephen did genuinely workshop and revise the material during that period," she explained. "That doesn't actually contradict what Dr. Osai's analysis established. Someone can genuinely, actively revise and develop a manuscript's specific scenes and prose, incorporating real, substantive feedback, while still fundamentally working from source material, your father's original manuscript, that wasn't actually their own creative property to begin with. The writing group's memories of watching real creative development happen aren't necessarily inaccurate. They just weren't watching the book's actual, original creation, the way they understood themselves to be. This distinction, that genuine, visible revision and development can still be built on a foundation of appropriated original material, became one of the more conceptually important, if genuinely uncomfortable, threads of this entire investigation, helping me understand exactly how Stephen had likely rationalized his own actions to himself for over 2 decades, treating real, substantive editorial labor on already stolen material as somehow equivalent to genuine. Original authorship. I want to return to Dr. Osai, because a broader conversation I had with him, near the conclusion of our case, offered genuinely important context about how his specific field has developed and what it might mean for other families facing similar, undiscovered situations. "I want you to understand that cases like yours are becoming more common for us to investigate, not because this kind of appropriation is necessarily happening more often now than it did decades ago, but because the forensic tools capable of definitively proving it have only recently become genuinely reliable and accessible," Dr. Osai told me. 10 or 15 years ago, the kind of analysis I performed on your father's manuscripts would have been considerably less statistically rigorous and considerably more vulnerable to challenge in a legal proceeding. The computational linguistics field has matured significantly, which means families who might have quietly suspected something like this for years, without any real way to definitively prove it, now increasingly have a genuine, scientifically credible path toward establishing the truth. I asked Dr. Osai whether he believed cases like my father's, quiet, private writers whose work was appropriated by someone with more outward ambition or connections, represented a genuinely common, if historically underrecognized, pattern. "I believe it's considerably more common than most people realize, precisely because it's so genuinely difficult to detect without exactly the kind of physical evidence your family fortunately still possessed. Your father's own dated, preserved manuscripts," he said. "Most historical appropriation of this kind likely occurred, and went permanently undiscovered, in situations where the original author's work was never preserved in any comparably durable, datable form. I think stories like yours, shared publicly, might genuinely help other families who have long harbored a similar, unresolved suspicion understand that meaningful investigation is now actually possible, in a way it simply wasn't a generation ago. For every family whose creative work might not be fully theirs. If you're watching this and someone in your own family has quietly, privately created something, writing, art, an invention, any form of original creative or intellectual work, that they've never fully pursued formal credit or protection for, I want to say something directly to you. Quiet, private creative work remains genuinely, legally valuable and genuinely vulnerable to exactly this kind of exploitation, particularly within families, where the ordinary boundaries and protections we might apply with strangers can feel, understandably, less necessary or less comfortable to formally establish. If you or someone you love maintains this kind of private creative archive, consider taking the simple, practical step of dating and properly documenting your work, the way my father, fortunately, had always done with his own careful, meticulous manuscript notation. A practice that, decades later, became the essential foundation of finally, definitively establishing the truth. And if you ever discover, as I did, evidence suggesting a family member's creative work might have been taken and claimed by someone else, know that forensic tools like stylometric analysis now exist to establish authorship with genuine, scientific rigor, tools that simply weren't available in any comparably reliable and accessible form, even 20 years ago. Tools that might today finally provide the kind of definitive evidence needed to correct a historical wrong that, in an earlier era, might have remained permanently, frustratingly unresolved. My father spent decades of quiet evenings creating something genuinely beautiful, work I believe, having now read all 3 of his preserved manuscripts in full, reflects real, considerable literary talent. He never got to see his own name properly, publicly attached to that work during his own lifetime. But it's there now, in every future printing of 2 novels that were always, truly his, and I think, somewhere, some part of him finally, fully rests easier knowing that. My name is Claire Whitfield Morgan, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of creative work in your own family that might deserve closer examination, or proper credit it never fully received, tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.